All right, so, we're always on the lookout for interesting reports and trends that are shaping the future. And you recently sent over one that really caught my eye about the global high pressure grinding roller market.
Yeah.
Now, I'll admit, HPGRs, they're not exactly a dinner table conversation topic.
Right.
But when you dig a little deeper, you realize these things, these incredibly powerful rollers, are actually kind of a big deal. They're used in all sorts of heavy industries like mining and cement production to basically crush and grind raw materials into usable forms.
Yeah, it's like it's essential for so many things. You think about the buildings we live in, the roads we drive on. A lot of that starts with these massive rollers doing their thing.
Exactly. It's kind of the unsung hero of modern industry. And that's why you wanted to take a deep dive into this report and really break down what's happening in this market, where it's headed, and what it means for the bigger picture.
It's a fascinating sector, and honestly, one that's poised for some pretty significant growth. And
Mm.
one of the first things that jumped out at me when I looked at this report was that the global HPGR market is expected to reach a value of USD 572.8 million in 2025.
Okay, so that's a pretty big number, but
Yeah, but it gets even more interesting
yeah.
because by 2033, that number is projected to skyrocket to USD 158.60 euro million. We're talking about almost doubling in size within a decade. And that's with a steady open. Compound annual growth rate of 9.20%.
Hmm.
I mean, that kind of consistent growth really tells you that something big is happening here.
Absolutely. I mean, when you see that kind of jump in market value, it's not just random fluctuation. It's a sign that industries are changing how they're doing things. And the report actually points to a pretty clear reason for this. More and more mining companies are starting to realize that HPGRs are a way to boost their bottom line.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? If you can find a technology that helps you produce more efficiently, use less energy, that's going to translate to higher profits. And I think that's a big part of what's driving this adoption.
And just to be clear about the time frame we're talking about, the report uses 2024 as its baseline. Includes historical data from 2021 to 2024, provides an estimate for 2025, and then forecasts all the way out to 2033. So it's a pretty thorough examination of where this market has been and where it's likely going.
And one thing that's really interesting is that this growth isn't happening evenly across the globe. There are some clear regional variations. So, for example, North America is currently the dominant player in the HPGR market. They hold over 40% of the global market share with projected market size of USD 211.94 million in 2025.
Okay, so North America's in the lead, but what about their growth rate? I mean, is it staying that way, or are things shifting?
Well, their growth rate is still solid, projected at 7.6% annually through 2033, but it's not the fastest we're seeing.
Interesting. Okay, so within North America, who are the big players?
Well, the U.S. is unsurprisingly the biggest, with a market size of USD 167.22 million in 2025 and a CAGR of 7.4%. Then you have Canada coming in at USD 25.43 million with a slightly faster growth rate of 8.4%. And finally, Mexico at USD 19.29 million and an 8.1% CGR. So there's some variation even within the region.
It's fascinating to see how these regional differences play out. I mean, what's the report say about why North America is so dominant in this market?
Well, they point to a few factors. One is the sophisticated level of their industries,
Mhm.
metallurgy, cement mining. They have a real need for advanced grinding technologies. And then there's also the constant push for industrialization and the adoption of energy-efficient solutions. All of that creates a really fertile ground for HPGRs to thrive.
It sounds like North American businesses are really embracing these technologies to optimize their operations and stay competitive.
Yeah. As absolutely. Now, if we shift our focus over to Europe, they're also a significant force in this market. They account for over 30% of the global market share, with a projected size of USD 166.11 million in 2025. And they're seeing a pretty healthy growth rate, too, at 8.2% annually through 2033.
Okay, so Europe is holding strong. And who are the key players to watch there?
Well, the UK is a major market with a projected size of USD 27.91 million in 2025 and a robust growth rate of 9%. Then there's Germany at USD 32.89 million and an 8.4% CAGR, and Russia at USD 25.75 million with a slightly slower 7.2% CAGR. So again, we see some interesting differences even within the region.
Definitely. And what's driving this growth in Europe? I mean, what's the report highlight as the key factors?
Well, Europe is really focused on modernizing its industrial processes. So there's a big push to upgrade their grinding technologies to make them more efficient. Yeah. And then there's also a growing mining sector in Europe that's contributing to demand.
And I imagine the environmental considerations are playing a role there as well, especially in places like Germany, where there's a strong emphasis on sustainability.
Oh, absolutely. Environmental regulations are definitely pushing companies to look for cleaner, more energy-efficient solutions, and HPGRs fit that bill pretty well.
All right, so we've got North America as the current leader, Europe holding its own. But what about the rest of the world? I mean, are there any other regions that are really poised to shake things up?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. You see, the Asia-Pacific region, which we often call APAC, is currently holding about 23% of the global market, with a size of USD 137.47 million in 2025.
Okay, so a decent chunk, but not the biggest player yet.
Right, but here's the thing. Their projected growth rate is absolutely phenomenal. We're talking about a 12% CAGR through 2033. That's significantly faster than any other region, and it really suggests that APAC is about to become a major force in the HPGR market.
Wow, 12%, that's huge. I
That's
mean,
right.
what's driving that kind of explosive growth?
Well, several factors are at play. You've got massive infrastructure development happening across the region, just a ton of construction going on. Then there's general industrial expansion. And then, of course, the mining and cement industries in APAC are really taking off. They need efficient solutions, and they're finding them in HPGR technology.
It's like all the pieces are falling into place for APAC to become the new center of gravity for this market. And the report even calls out China and India specifically as the driving forces behind this surge.
Exactly. China's market is projected to be at USD 57.74 million in 2025, with a CAGR of 11.5%. And India is even more impressive at USD 13.75 million with a 13.9% EGR. I mean, those are incredible numbers, and they really highlight the shift that's underway.
Definitely. It's like we're witnessing the rise of a new powerhouse in the HPGR market now. What about South America? Are they in the mix?
Yeah, South America's got a solid growth trajectory. Their market share is more than 5% with a projected size of USD 21.77 million in 2025, and they're looking at a key AGR of 9.9%.
Not too shabby. Okay. And who are the key players down there?
Well, Brazil and Argentina are the ones to watch.
Oh.
Brazil's market is projected to be at USD 9.32 million with a 10.5% CAGR, and Argentina comes in at USD 3.66 million with a 10.8% CAGR. So good city growth in both countries.
And what's fueling that growth? What's the report say?
What's a familiar story?
Hmm.
Really, continued industrialization across South America is creating a lot of demand, and then the push for energy-efficient solutions in mining, metallurgy, cement production, all of that's playing a role.
So even though South America's market size is smaller right now compared to like North America or Europe, it's definitely a region with a lot of potential. And what about the Middle East and Africa? Are they making any moves in the HPGR market?
Yeah, so the Middle East represents about 2% of the global market right now, with a projected size of USD 22.91 million in 2025 and a KGR of 10.5%. And Africa is at about 1% with USD 12.60 million and a 9.5% CAGR.
So smaller markets overall, but still decent growth rates.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that the report highlights how each region's priorities are influencing how they're adopting HPGR technology. So, for example, in Qatar, there's a big focus on energy-saving initiatives.
Yeah.
So they're drawn to the efficiency of HPGRs. And then in South Africa, there's a lot of emphasis on automation. So they're looking for ways to integrate HPGRs into their automated systems.
It really shows how these global trends are playing out on a regional level, with each area adapting the technology to fit its specific needs and goals now that we've got a good handle on the global and regional landscape. I think it's time to zoom in a bit and look at how the HPGR market is segmented, breaking it down by things like power rating, material processed applications, and end users.
This is good. Let's dive in.
All right, so first up, power rating. These HPGRs come in a range of sizes and power levels. So how's the market divided based on that?
Well, according to the report, the 2 by 100 kilowatt is to 2 by 650 kilowatt power rating segment is expected to be the dominant one. And it makes sense. This range offers a good balance of versatility and affordability. It can handle a variety of materials and processes, and it's not prohibitively expensive. So it's a popular choice for a lot of companies in sectors like cement and mining.
So that's kind of the workhorse segment, the one that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting across different industries. But I imagine there are other segments that are growing rapidly as technology advances and demands change.
You get it. The fastest growing segment is actually the 2 by 3,700 kilowatt and above. So we're talking about some seriously powerful machines here. And this growth is being driven by the need for even larger scale grinding solutions. Projects that require massive throughput and the ability to handle very hard abrasive materials.
It's like the bigger the project, the more powerful the HPGR needed.
Exactly. And advancements in technology have made these larger systems more viable and more cost-effective over time. So we're seeing a trend towards these really large-scale installations, especially in mining and cement production.
Okay, so we've covered power rating now. Let's talk about the materials being processed by these HPGRs. What's the breakdown there?
Well, the largest share in the market right now belongs to the ferrous metals and ferroalloys processing segment. So basically, this is the segment that's dealing with things like steel and iron or, the fundamental building blocks of a lot of heavy industries. And HPGRs have been used extensively in these sectors for a long time. They're very efficient at producing the finely ground materials that these industries need.
So the foundational metal production industries are the biggest users for now, but are there other materials gaining traction?
Yeah, absolutely. The fastest growing segment is actually the non-ferrous metals processing segment. So
Hmm.
think things like copper, gold, nickel. These are essential metals for a huge range of industries, electronics, construction, you name it. And the demand for these metals is skyrocketing.
So as those industries grow, so does the demand for HPGRs to process the raw materials.
Very. They're cost effective. They're very efficient at processing these metals, and they're also aligned with the growing global emphasis on eco-friendly mining practices. So there's a lot of momentum behind this segment.
It's interesting to see how those economic and environmental factors are converging to drive that growth. Now let's talk about applications. What are these HPGRs actually being used for in these different industries?
Well, the diamond liberation segment currently holds the largest market share.
Diamonds. That's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah, well, it makes sense when you think about it. You see, HPGRs are incredibly effective at separating diamonds from the surrounding rock.
Hmm.
They can create a very fine and consistent particle size, which leads to higher diamond recovery rates. And they do it while using less energy, which is crucial in the mining industry. So for high-value applications like diamond extraction, HPGRs are a really attractive option.
So it's all about maximizing efficiency and minimizing waste in a very specific and valuable industry. Now, what about the fastest growing application area? Where are we seeing the most rapid adoption?
Well, that would be precious metal beneficiation.
Hmm.
And this is being driven by the increasing demand for silver and gold. Those metals are always in high demand, and HPGRs are proving to be a very efficient and cost-effective way to process them.
So again, it's about meeting that growing global demand, but doing it in a smarter, more efficient way.
Exactly. And, the report also mentions other applications like base metal liberation and pellet feed preparation, but it doesn't go into detail about their individual growth rates.
Okay, so we've got a sense of the application landscape now. Finally, let's talk about the end users. Who's actually buying and using these HPGRs? Which industries are the primary consumers?
Well, the report identifies mining as the largest end user segment, which makes sense, right? We've been talking about how important HPGRs are for processing minerals and ores. So the mining industry is naturally a huge consumer of this technology.
And that makes sense. They're the ones at the front lines of extracting these raw materials. And what about the fastest growing end user segment? Where's the most rapid adoption happening?
That would be the ore and mineral processing category. It's a broader category than just mining it. Encompasses all the different stages of processing these raw materials. And as the demand for these materials grows, the need for efficient processing techniques grows along with it. So HPGRs are really well positioned to capitalize on this trend.
So it's like the ripple effect from all those industries that rely on these raw materials. The demand is trickling down to the processing stage and driving the adoption of HPGRs.
Exactly. And the report does mention others as an additional end user category, but it doesn't provide specifics.
Okay, so we've got a good sense of the end user landscape now. Let's step back and consider the bigger picture. What are the key market dynamics that are influencing this growth and shaping the future of the HPGR market?
Well, the report highlights a few key drivers.
Hmm.
Firstly, there's the rising global demand for essential minerals like gold and copper. We talked about that. And this demand is only going to increase as industries grow and populations rise.
It's like the fundamental building blocks of our modern world, and HPGRs are a key part of making those materials accessible.
Exactly. And then secondly, there's the growing recognition among mining companies that HPGRs can actually enhance their profitability. I mean, that's a powerful motivator.
Absolutely. If you can find a way to produce more efficiently, use less energy, and ultimately boost your profits, that's going to drive adoption pretty quickly. Are there any factors that might be hindering the market's growth?
Yeah, the report does mention one key restraint, and that's the limited scope of application for HPGRs.
Hmm.
They're not a universal solution. They're not going to replace every single type of grinding technology out there. So that does put a bit of a cap on their overall market potential.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a specialized tool that's very effective in certain areas, but not necessarily everywhere.
Right. And then in terms of overall trends, the report highlights a couple of key ones. There's the increasing global demand for a wide range of minerals and metals coming from industries like electronics manufacturing and construction. And that's putting a lot of pressure on raw material processing to be more efficient, more cost-effective.
It's like a chain reaction, the more we consume, the more demand there is for raw materials, the more pressure there is to optimize the extraction and processing of those materials.
Exactly. And then the other key trend is the growing need for skilled labor to operate and maintain these increasingly sophisticated HPGR systems. It's not just about having the technology, it's about having the people who can run it effectively. And as these systems become more complex, that skills gap becomes more pronounced.
It's a reminder that technology is only as good as the people who are using it now. Let's talk about the companies that are actually developing and manufacturing these HPGR systems. What's the competitive landscape look like?
While the report describes the market as highly competitive, there are a lot of players, both global and regional. And it lists some of the key companies, including Selecting Heavy Industries, FL Smith, KHD, Humboldt, Widag International, AG Metso, Oijcast Steel Products, the Weir Group, PLC, ThyssenKrupp Copper Group Autotech, and AKRA GmbH. So quite a diverse mix.
A lot of familiar names in there and some perhaps less familiar. It sounds like there's a healthy mix of established players and newer companies trying to make their mark.
Exactly. And the report does mention that market share data for some competitors is confidential.
Yeah.
So there's probably even more happening behind the scenes than we're fully aware of.
Now, the report also mentions some recent activity in terms of mergers and acquisitions and divestitures, right? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there have been some interesting moves. For example, back in July 2021, FL Smith acquired ThyssenKrupp's mining operations, with the exception of those in India, for a whopping EUR 280 million. So a pretty significant acquisition and a clear indication that FL Smith is looking to expand its footprint in the mining sector.
A major consolidation in the market. And then there was also some news about Metso, wasn't there?
Yeah, in March 2022, Metso sold off its process automation systems division to Valmet. And this was part of a strategic move by Metso to really focus on their core businesses, which are aggregates and mining technologies and their flow control systems.
So it's like they're streamlining their operations, shedding what's not essential, and doubling down on their core strength.
Exactly. And these moves by major players really highlight the dynamism of the HPGR market. It's not a static industry. It's constantly evolving as companies adapt to new technologies, new demands, new competitive pressures.
All right, so this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the global HPGR market report. A lot of information to digest, but let's try to summarize some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Absolutely. So we learned that the HPGR market is projected to almost double in value by 2033, which is pretty significant. North America is currently the largest market, but the Asia-Pacific region is the fastest growing, and we're seeing particular growth in the non-ferrous metals processing and precious metal beneficiation segments.
And it's clear that the increasing global demand for minerals and metals is a major driver of this growth, along with the push for more efficient, sustainable mining and processing practices.
Exactly. And to leave our listeners with a final thought, it's worth considering how future advancements in material science, even more durable or efficient roller materials or changes in environmental regulations around the world could further impact the growth of this market.
It's a reminder that this is a dynamic industry, one that's closely tied to global trends and technological innovation. So if you're interested in the future of mining manufacturing and the materials that make our modern world possible, the HPGR market is definitely one to keep an eye on.